My son-in-law had no idea I owned the hospital network his hospital answered to. He always saw me as a retired mechanic in a rusted Carhartt jacket who fixed his own truck and clipped coupons at the grocery store. One evening, he invited me to a private dinner with his parents to celebrate his promotion to chief of surgery. I accepted the invitation, wanting to see exactly how they would treat a poor man. They showed their true colors the moment his father slid a folded check across the linen tablecloth, offering to pay me to disappear from my own daughter's wedding announcement. 10 minutes later, the foundation of their entire world began to crack. Before I continue, let me know where you're watching from. Son or daughter, grandson or granddaughter, tell me in the comments. And if you believe arrogance always comes with a price, hit like and subscribe. The November wind off Lake Erie cut through my flannel jacket like it had a personal grudge against me. I stood on the curb outside Bellwood Chop House, watching valets in white gloves jog between a fleet of German sedans, and I looked down at my boots, steel-toed, cracked across the left instep, the kind of boots a man wears when he still believes his feet ought to be protected, even though he hasn't set foot on a factory floor in 11 years. I could have bought that steakhouse in the parking garage next to it without touching my quarterly dividends. I wore the boots anyway. I parked my truck 4 blocks away because I didn't want some kid in a vest judging the dents in my tailgate. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 62 years old, and I've spent 4 decades learning that money whispered is money that lasts, and money shouted is money that gets stolen. I built Kessler Regional Health from a single urgent care clinic in a strip mall to a network of 11 hospitals across 3 states, and I did it by staying invisible. The board knows me as a name on a filing. My own employees, 22,000 of them, wouldn't recognize my face in an elevator. That was always the plan. I wanted my daughter Diane to grow up knowing the value of a dollar she had to earn, not the weight of a dollar she was born into. Diane was the reason I was freezing on that curb. She'd married Mitchell Vance 4 years ago, a sharp, ambitious surgical resident who charmed her with flowers and late-night phone calls during his rotations. I saw straight through him inside the first 10 minutes of meeting him. I watched his eyes catalog the restaurant, the other diners, the size of everyone's watch. He was polite to me the way a man is polite to a doorman, functional courtesy with no warmth underneath it. He believed I'd spent my working life as a shop floor mechanic who'd scraped together a pension. He believed my 2-bedroom Rambler on Delmar Street, the one I built the back deck on with my own 2 hands, was the ceiling of everything I'd ever amount to. I never corrected him. I wanted Diane loved for who she was, not for the trust her mother had left her, and certainly not for a father-in-law's bank balance Mitchell didn't know existed. When Mitchell told me his parents, Gerald and Patricia, were flying in from Scottsdale to celebrate his appointment as chief of surgery at Bellwood Memorial, he invited me along with all the enthusiasm of a man renewing his car registration. I said yes. I needed to look this family in the eye and understand exactly what kind of people my daughter had married into. I pushed through the brass doors, and the warmth hit me first. Garlic and seared beef and somebody's expensive perfume. The hostess looked at my jacket like it had wandered in off the street on its own. I gave her Mitchell's name, and she led me past white tablecloths toward the private room in the back, her heels clicking a little too fast, like she wanted to be rid of me. The door was cracked open. I stepped in, and the temperature of the room dropped before anyone said a word. Gerald sat at the head of the table in a suit that fit him the way only tailored things fit, a watch on his wrist heavy enough to be a warning. Patricia wore a cream dress and a string of pearls, and her face did the same slow, sour twist Gerald's did when they clocked my jacket, my boots, the gray stubble I hadn't bothered shaving. Mitchell sat between them, turning a glass of Cabernet by the stem, and he didn't stand up either. Nobody did. Diane wasn't there yet. Mitchell said she'd gone to find the restroom to fix her hair after the drive. I pulled out the chair at the far end, as far from the family as the table allowed, and sat down in a silence so thick you could have spread it on bread. The interrogation started the second the waiter filled my water glass. Patricia leaned in, diamonds catching the low light, and asked how I'd been managing my little house through the cold snap, dragging out the word little like she was describing something she'd stepped in. She complained about the cost of heating their guest wing in Scottsdale. Gerald bragged about a golf trip to St. Andrews. And then he looked at my boots and asked, not unkindly on the surface, but with a blade underneath it, what exactly I used to do for work. I told him the truth. I told him I spent years with my hands in engines, running a garage, keeping fleets on the road. I left out the part where I eventually owned the freight company those fleets belonged to, and then the 12 companies after that, and then the hospital network that employed his son. Gerald laughed, short and dismissive, and traded a look with Patricia that said everything about how they'd already filed me away. Grease monkey, charity case, a man they were tolerating for their son's sake. Mitchell wouldn't meet my eyes. His jaw was tight, a flush creeping up his collar, like my presence at this table was something he had to apologize for later. The food came, and Gerald didn't touch his plate. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded check, crisp, the paper practically snapping as he unfolded it on the tablecloth. He pressed it flat with 2 fingers and slid it down the table until it stopped in front of my water glass. I looked at it, then at him. I asked what it was. He told me, plain as ordering a drink, that it was for $30,000. A gift, he called it, though the word gift had never sounded so much like a threat. The condition was simple. I was to tell Diane I'd decided to move somewhere warmer for my health, somewhere far enough that I wouldn't be attending the announcement dinner. Mitchell's Hospital Foundation was throwing next month to introduce the new chief of surgery and his family to the donor board. A man who looked like I did, he said, wasn't the kind of father-in-law who belonged in photographs next to people who wrote 7-figure checks to the hospital. My chest went tight and still, the way it does right before you decide something for good. I asked him why I would ever do that. Gerald's voice dropped lower, uglier. He said Mitchell had worked too hard to let a used-up garage mechanic embarrass him in front of the board. He said appearances mattered at that level, that donors gave money to polish, not to people who looked like they'd wandered in from a tow yard. He told me to take the check and disappear quietly, for everyone's sake, especially Diane's. I turned to Mitchell. I asked him straight out if he agreed with his father. I asked if he wanted me gone from that dinner, gone from his life, gone from the pictures his family would show their donors. Mitchell finally lifted his head, and he agreed. He said his career at Bellwood was too important to risk on optics, that a chief of surgery couldn't have a father-in-law who looked like he changed his own oil in the driveway. He told me to take the money and do what was best for the family. The word family sat on that table like something rotten. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that Bellwood Memorial, the crown jewel of the hospital system he was about to represent to a room full of wealthy donors, sat inside a network whose entire board answered, quietly, through 4 layers of holding companies, to a blind trust with my name buried at the bottom of it. He had no idea that the man he was buying off with $30,000 could, with one phone call, have ended his residency review, his fellowship recommendation, his entire career trajectory before it started. The door opened. Diane walked back in, hair freshly brushed, smiling, asking if we'd already ordered appetizers, completely unaware of what had just happened at that table. Before anyone could speak, I reached out and slid the check smoothly into my jacket pocket. Gerald and Patricia exchanged a small, satisfied glance. Mitchell let out a breath he'd clearly been holding. They thought I'd folded. They thought the old mechanic had taken the money like a man grateful for the scraps. I looked at my daughter. Kind, warm, entirely too good for the people at that table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. Anger belongs to people with no other options, and I had every option in the world. I stood up slowly, reached into my pocket, and pulled out a single, crumpled dollar bill. I flattened it against the tablecloth and set it in the center of my empty plate. I told Mitchell that dollar covered my water. I turned to Diane, told her the cold had given me a headache, and that I needed to go home and rest. She stepped toward me, worried, offering to drive me herself. I kissed her forehead and told her to stay, to enjoy the evening. I told her I'd call her in the morning. I walked out through the dining room, past the clinking glasses and the laughter of people who'd never had to count anything in their lives, pushed through the brass doors, and let the Cleveland wind hit me full in the face. I didn't feel the cold anymore. The tired old man I'd been wearing for 2 hours peeled off me like a coat. My spine straightened. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in almost a year. It rang once. Priya Anand, my general counsel and the architect of the trust that owned Kessler Regional, picked up without a greeting, the way she always did when she knew something serious was coming. I told her they'd taken the bait. I told her my son-in-law had just crossed a line there'd be no walking back from. Priya had been managing the blind trust for 9 years, and in all that time, I'd never once used it as a weapon. That night, sitting in my kitchen with the porch light off and a mug of black coffee going cold in front of me, I told her to pull every file connected to Bellwood Memorial's surgical department budget going back 18 months. It took her 4 days to call me back. And when she did, her voice had a flatness to it I recognized. The sound of someone who'd found something they wished they hadn't. Mitchell wasn't just spending too freely. He was moving money. Small at first, 18 months ago, transfers routed through a surgical equipment vendor that didn't exist anywhere except on paper. A shell registered to an address that turned out to be a UPS store in Scottsdale. The invoices were for equipment Bellwood never received. Over the past year and a half, more than $600,000 had bled out of the hospital's surgical budget into that vendor's account. And from there, in smaller pieces designed not to trip any alarms, into two accounts belonging to Gerald and Patricia Vance. I sat at my kitchen table until 3 in the morning with printouts spread out under the yellow light, tracing the same $600,000 through 4 accounts, watching a pattern I recognized instantly because I'd built systems for 20 years specifically to prevent it. Mitchell hadn't just tolerated his parents' lifestyle. He'd been funding it, quietly bleeding his own hospital to keep his father in golf trips and his mother in pearls, and using his growing authority as incoming chief of surgery to make sure nobody looked too closely at a department that had just gotten a new budget structure under his direction. The dinner made sense to me now, in a way that turned my stomach. It wasn't really about appearances. Appearances were the excuse. What Mitchell actually needed was distance, real distance, between his family and anyone who might one day ask sharp questions about where the surgical department's money was going. A father-in-law who looked poor and asked no questions was convenient. A father-in-law who might start asking questions, even by accident, was a liability. He wanted me gone before I got curious. He just hadn't counted on me already knowing more about that hospital than he did. I thought about calling Diane that same night. I didn't. She'd moved in with Mitchell 3 years ago, and in those 3 years I'd watched something dim behind her eyes that used to be bright, a woman getting smaller in her own marriage, without ever quite being able to say why. She needed proof, not suspicion. She needed to see it laid out so plainly that no lawyer, no charm, no folded check could talk her out of what was true. I spent the next 5 weeks the way I'd spent the early years of my career, invisible and patient. Priya and I built a case file thick enough to choke a filing cabinet, working with a forensic accountant she trusted from her days at the state attorney general's office, a quiet woman named Renata who could read a spreadsheet the way some people read a novel. We traced every shell company back to its UPS store, every wire transfer back to its origin, every falsified invoice back to the signature that approved it. Mitchell's signature. Always Mitchell's. The hospital foundation's donor dinner, the one Mitchell had wanted me nowhere near, was scheduled for the second Saturday of December in the grand ballroom of the Ritz downtown. 300 donors, board members, city officials. Mitchell was set to be introduced formally as the new chief of surgery, the golden face of Bellwood Memorial's future. I bought a table. Not personally, not under the Kessler name anyone at that hospital would recognize. Through the trust, under a holding company called Lakeshore Health Partners, the same entity that, 4 layers up, owned the controlling interest in the entire network. Nobody at that gala had any reason to connect Lakeshore Health Partners to a retired mechanic in a flannel jacket. That was the entire point of building it that way. I rented a suit, charcoal gray, the first suit I'd worn in 11 years, and I stood in front of my bathroom mirror that Saturday evening, feeling like a stranger looking back at me. A man I used to be and had chosen, for Diane's sake, to stop being. I picked up Diane myself. She wore a navy dress her mother would have loved, and in the car she was quiet, and when I asked her what was wrong, she finally told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that things at home had been strained, that Mitchell had been short-tempered and distant, that his parents had been pressuring them both about appearances constantly, about how Diane presented herself, about who she talked to, about me. I told her everything would be clear by the end of the night. She didn't understand what I meant. I didn't explain. The ballroom was gold and white, chandeliers throwing soft light over round tables dressed in cream linen. Gerald and Patricia were seated near the front, close to the podium, dressed like they were the ones being honored. Mitchell stood near the stage in a tuxedo, shaking hands, laughing at things that weren't especially funny, playing the part of the rising star with practiced ease. I sat with Diane at a table toward the back, close enough to see everything, far enough that nobody would think twice about an older man in a rented suit sitting quietly with his daughter. The hospital board chair took the podium around 8, thanked the donors for their generosity, and began the formal introduction of Dr. Mitchell Vance as Bellwood Memorial's new chief of surgery. Mitchell walked up to a wave of polite applause, adjusted the microphone, and started into remarks about legacy and excellence and the future of patient care that sounded like they'd been written by someone who'd never actually worried about a patient in his life. That was when Priya, seated 2 tables over with Renata beside her, gave me the small nod we'd agreed on. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I walked to the small side podium the board had set up for closing remarks from major donors, and the board chair, recognizing the name Lakeshore Health Partners from the seating chart, waved me forward without hesitation, assuming I was there to say something gracious about the hospital's future. I looked out at 300 faces, found Gerald and Patricia near the front, found Mitchell still standing at center stage, his easy smile freezing slightly as he registered who was walking toward the microphone. I introduced myself, not as Walter Kessler, retired mechanic, as Walter Kessler, controlling trustee of Lakeshore Health Partners, majority holder of Kessler Regional Health, the parent company of Bellwood Memorial Hospital. The room didn't gasp so much as go still. 300 people recalibrating who they were looking at in real time. I thanked the board for their trust over the years. I told them how proud I was of what this hospital had built. And then I said that pride came with a responsibility to be honest with the people in this room, the people whose donations kept this hospital's doors open. I said that an internal financial review, conducted independently over the past several weeks, had identified significant, sustained misappropriation of surgical department funds routed through fraudulent vendor accounts, and that the individual responsible for authorizing those transactions was standing on this very stage. I watched every ounce of color drain out of Mitchell's face. I said I wouldn't turn this into a spectacle. I said the matter had already been referred to the appropriate authorities, and that as of that morning, Dr. Vance's position as chief of surgery and his privileges at Bellwood Memorial entirely had been suspended pending investigation. Gerald shot to his feet, his face a violent shade of red, sputtering something about a mistake, about lawyers, about how dare anyone. Patricia sat frozen, her pearls suddenly looking like something borrowed. Mitchell didn't move at all. He just stood there under the chandelier light with 300 donors staring at him, understanding all at once exactly who I was and exactly what he'd tried to buy off 6 weeks earlier for $30,000. Diane sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so hard it hurt, tears streaming silently down her face. Not from grief, I would learn later, but from a strange, overwhelming relief. The feeling of finally understanding a marriage that had never made sense to her. I didn't stay to watch the rest unfold. I walked Diane out of that ballroom myself, past Gerald still shouting at the board chair, past Patricia sitting motionless at her table, past Mitchell standing alone under the lights like a man who just watched his entire future evaporate in under 2 minutes. The federal investigation moved faster once Renata's audit trail landed on the right desk. Wire fraud across state lines, falsified corporate invoices, healthcare fraud tied to funds that touched Medicare reimbursements. It was enough to bring in federal prosecutors within a month. Mitchell's medical license was suspended before Christmas, revoked entirely by spring. Gerald and Patricia, it turned out, hadn't just been receiving their son's stolen money, they'd helped set up 2 of the shell accounts themselves, which turned a family scandal into a family indictment. Their house in Scottsdale sold at a loss to cover legal fees and restitution. The golf club membership Gerald had bragged about at that dinner was the first thing to go. Mitchell took a plea deal rather than risk trial, 18 months in a low-security federal facility and 5 years of supervised release, along with a restitution order that would follow him for the rest of his working life, assuming any hospital would ever let him near a medical license again, which none would. Diane filed for divorce 2 weeks after the gala. She didn't cry when she signed the papers. She told me, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of the same cheap coffee I've been drinking for 30 years, that she felt like she was finally waking up from a very long, very expensive dream that had never actually belonged to her. She moved back into her childhood bedroom that spring, the one with the window that still sticks in humid weather, the one I never got around to fixing, because some part of me always hoped she'd need it again someday, and I wanted it exactly the way she left it. 6 months passed. This past Saturday morning, I sat on my back deck, the one I built with my own hands the summer Diane turned 9, holding a chipped mug of coffee, watching the sun come up gray and gold over the Kessler's old maple tree. The screen door creaked, and Diane came out in one of my old sweatshirts, sat down beside me without a word, and we watched the neighborhood wake up together, Mrs. Ferraro walking her beagle across the street, the recycling truck groaning around the corner. The dark circles under Diane's eyes are gone now. The tension she used to carry in her shoulders, the way she used to flinch slightly whenever her phone buzzed, that's gone too. She's working 3 days a week at the county library, cataloging donated books, and she told me last month it's the first job she's ever had that nobody chose for her. She asked me once why I don't move somewhere bigger, somewhere that matches what she now knows I'm worth. I told her the same thing I've believed since before she was born. A house is just lumber and drywall. A home is the place where you measured your daughter's height on the doorframe every August until she left for college, where you taught her to ride a bike in the driveway, where the memories are load-bearing in a way no marble staircase could ever be. Money doesn't buy that kind of foundation. It never has. Back at Bellwood Memorial, the surgical department has a new chief now, a woman named Dr. Osei, who spent 15 years building a reputation for exactly the kind of quiet competence Mitchell only ever performed. The budget office runs 3 layers of independent verification now on every vendor contract, a policy I insisted on personally, one small permanent scar the hospital will carry from all of this, and one that will keep it from happening again to some other family. I still don't sit in a corner office. I don't need to. Priya runs the daily business of the trust with the same careful precision she always has, and I stay in the background, guiding things quietly the way I always have. The money was never the point of any of this. It never needed to be seen to be real. Sunday morning, the light came up slow and orange over the block, catching the frost still clinging to the grass, and I took another sip of coffee that had probably gone lukewarm 20 minutes earlier, and I didn't care. Somewhere out there, Mitchell was waking up in a facility with a number instead of a title. Gerald and Patricia were waking up in a rental condo instead of an estate, learning for the first time in their lives what it feels like to worry about a bill. And here, on this porch, with my daughter's shoulder against mine, there was nothing but quiet. I've learned a few things in 62 years that no business degree ever taught me. Real strength doesn't need an audience. The people who feel the need to announce their worth with watches and vacations and folded checks are usually the ones with the least worth to actually stand on. And the greatest thing I ever built wasn't a hospital network or a trust worth more than most people will see in 10 lifetimes. It was this, a daughter who knows now, without any doubt, that she was loved for exactly who she is and nothing else. If this story reminded you of your own father, or the quiet ones in your life who never ask for credit, tell me about them in the comments. And if you believe love without conditions is the only kind worth having, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.